Hello, I'm Mario Toneguzzi, co-editor-in-chief of Retail Insider, taking care of retail business today with Doug Stevens, who is founder of Retail Profit. Thanks for joining us today, Doug.
It's my pleasure, Mario. Thanks for having me.
Well, I wanted to touch on a couple of things on retail and trends in the business. The first one is a piece you penned recently, actually, for Retail Insider, talking about technology versus art in retail. Um, Do you think we've lost, with all this technology that's upon us, do you think we've lost the art of retail? And if we have, why is that important?
Yeah, so I do. I think it's fair to say that I think in general we really have lost sight of the fact that while technology can certainly be an enabler of experiences, it can certainly facilitate operational efficiency. It can certainly make the process of retailing easier. I do think at its root, what we're really talking about is a sensory, emotional in some cases, but certainly tactile and physical experience. And if we lose sight of the fact that there's a stagecraft to this, I think we're really losing an engagement with the consumer. And I'll explain sort of what the article kind of gets at. And that is that when we look at, I mean, if we back off for a second and we say, what is a retailer's objective? At the end of the day, what is it that we're out to do?
Mhm.
Well, certainly we want to sell things. There's no question. And so from that standpoint, we have to have the right product in the right place at the right time, all the stuff that we've talked about for decades.
Yeah.
But at what we also should be thinking of for the customer that may come in and maybe not purchase anything that day in the store, what do we want them to leave with? And ideally, I think what we want them to leave with is a memory, and a favorable one, and one that can be recalled, right? So that the next time they think about, oh, I need to buy some electronics or sporting goods,
Mhm.
that retailer immediately comes to mind. So that leads me to sort of say, okay, well, what are the things in our lives that are really embedded memories? So we can remember the lyrics to songs that were meaningful to us.
Yeah.
When we get together, I mean, how many times have people gotten together at parties and talked about, lines from Monty Python and the Holy Grail, or lines from a Seinfeld episode?
Yeah.
How many times have we been in an art gallery, perhaps somewhere in the world, and for whatever reason, we see a Van Gogh and we're looking into the eyes of the subject, and somehow we make a personal connection. So I really started to kind of pull on this thread of art. And as it turns out, art actually stimulates our brain in a way that nothing else does. When we've looked at clinical studies on the brain as it's being exposed to art, whether that's music, dance, theater, film, etc., we see the brain just light up. And it's every aspect. It's our motor skills, tapping our toes at a concert. It's our visual acuity, focused on the singers or the entertainers. It's the familiarity of the song that resonates with us. And that's something that's stored in our hippocampus. And so I thought, ultimately what retailers ought to be targeting is this sort of full activation of the brain on the part of the consumer. And the truth is, when we walk into most retail stores today, Mario, and
Yeah.
I'm sure as someone who spends an awful lot of time in an awful lot of stores, you'll back me up on this. We're not getting that. We're sort of getting this very clinical antiseptic experience that really leaves not much of a memory at all. So
Yeah.
I think that ultimately we have to balance both. I think that we have to look at technology as being just another paint on our palette that we can use to craft and to underpin the experience. But really at the end of the exercise, we need to be thinking, how can we activate the consumer's sense of of touch, of sound, of taste, of feel. How can we connect with them intellectually and emotionally and light their brains up so they remember us?
Yeah. And and the memory of us, I just go through my younger years, I guess, and I things I recall, right, are certain jingles, commercials, right? I recall mottos like the "Just Do It" or "Things go better with Coke," all that stuff. That's like right in there, right?
It's an
Why,
earworm, right?
why,
Yeah.
why have we lost that? Obviously, yeah, there are jingles and there are, mottos out there for retailers, but they don't seem to resonate like they used to. I don't know why.
I think that the nature of retail as an industry has changed significantly. I think that the changes in nature of the public market have changed. I think that investor expectations of retailers have
Hmm.
forced many retailers to become far more transactional. If you look at just sort of look at the story arc of a retailer like let's pick Lululemon, for example.
Hmm.
Um, when Lululemon first came to market, it was very much sort of the cultural and emotional manifestation of Chip Smith's brain, right? And so when you walked into a Lululemon store, it looked different, it felt different, the interactions you had were different. There was definitely sort of this cultural vibe to the brand. And it was that really brought Lululemon to the foreground. It was
Yeah.
that made us stand up and look at this retailer and say, wow, that's really cool. And then all of a sudden, the company grows, it scales, it becomes public. And you see Lululemon then going through a period of time where growth became the objective. It wasn't culture, it wasn't experience, it wasn't forming sort of this community of like-minded consumers. It was about sales. It was about how can we move more merchandise. And it was at that point that the brand really started to lose that connection. They started to falter. They started to make tactical errors because I think they really lost sight of that North Star. And so they have now come back to that. They have returned, I think, to following that sense of purpose and animating that purpose across every interaction with consumers. But I think that is largely to blame. It's sort of we've lost this sense of theater. We've lost this sense of craft. And when we have a store now that is theatrical or experiential, we call it a concept store.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
it's an aberration to what is normal. But in my mind, every store needs to be an experiential concept store, every single location.
No, over the last few years, I recall, I've always recalled this one phrase and by a marketer, but it was that storytelling is the new marketing. How important is storytelling for a brand and why?
Yeah, storytelling is important because it is the way that human beings internalize information best. We've all gone to conferences and sat through presentations that are, sort of a disconnected series of facts and information, and it's just this sort of download of information. And while the facts may be correct and while the research may be robust and trustworthy, the way it's being presented to us is in such a fashion that it's very difficult to retain. And so we may walk out and say, wow, that guy's a really smart presenter, but
Yeah.
to be honest, I can't remember a single thing he said. On the other hand, when somebody stands up and they tell you a story that draws you in, that connects with you both, on an intellectual level, yeah, I'm following this. It makes sense. I get it. But it also appeals to your emotional side. Like, yeah, this resonates with me. It means something to me. I find this either, I find this compelling. I find this sad, or I find it makes me happy.
Yeah.
We really remember that content. And so, again, if we're coming back to this idea that a retailer's chief priority should not necessarily just be the sale. It should be the memory.
Mm.
It should be implanting that, like you said, remembering that jingle or remembering that tagline. Well, you want, as a retailer, that consumer to remember that experience and to associate it with some form of pleasure or value. And if you can do that through storytelling, that's a huge step forward.
Mm. Let's talk a little bit about the changing nature of the competitive advantage in retail. Now, I know that you've penned some thoughts on this as well, calling it an end of an era. Why is it the end of an era?
So I'll take you through my thinking on this. And you're right. I've been spending an awful lot of time now sort of thinking about, when in retail, we talk a lot about how we compete, and the things we use to compete. But what we don't talk a lot about is the fundamental bedrock nature of competition itself. And so I'll take you through my thinking. So I came across an article recently. It was an article about Amazon, and it said that Amazon was testing out, it was experimenting with a device called an electrolyzer in its Aurora, Colorado warehouse facility. An electrolyzer is a device that turns water into hydrogen. And Amazon is partnering with a company called Plug Power to create hydrogen in this facility. And that hydrogen is then used to power the tow motors and forklifts, et cetera, all the machinery within the facility.
Mm.
And it's a bit of a bet on the future. Amazon is doing so because it wants to try and further its goal of zero emissions by 2040. But it's also a bet on the cost of hydrogen, that hydrogen over time, while fossil fuels continue to rise in cost, the belief is that hydrogen is actually going to scale. It's going to come down in cost. And so
Mhm.
Amazon will eventually, at some point, in theory, arrive at this point where it has this distinct, significant competitive advantage over other competitors, say like Temu or Alibaba. And that really got me thinking. I thought, so here you have, in one move, you have a very asymmetrical competitive move on the chessboard. This is not something that, this isn't just about lowering prices or adding more products. This is out of left field. It's a move that could be long-term in its advantage because there's a significant learning curve and kind of a cultural belief system associated with this. And finally, it actually produces a positive outcome for society. So I started thinking again, I thought, well, wait a minute, what other aspects of society could benefit if retailers started looking at them differently? And I know we're limited on time, but it leads me back to 1945. In 1945, in this country, as GIs were returning from Europe, democracy, the winds of democracy were blowing freely across North America and Europe.
Yeah.
Bipartisan government spent tremendous amounts of money building education programs for returning GIs. They gave small business loans to GIs to form their own business. They leaned into domestic industry. They funded the growth of domestic industry and domestic factories and production. And education spending was through the roof. They were sending returning war veterans to university. The University of British Columbia, for example, had to move in temporary housing. They had so many people attending school. And so from 1945 to 1970, you had this robust and significant growth of the middle class. People felt that their fortunes were rising. More people were going to university. We had the most educated generations in history. Unions were gaining power and union wages were going up. Life was good. By the 1960s in this country, you couldn't contain retail. Shoppers Drug Mart and umpteen different retailers during that period popped up. Retail literally could not keep up with demand.
Yeah.
And since that time, however, starting in about the 80s, I think we really started to steal from that piggy bank. We saw a change where we weren't investing in domestic industry anymore. We were offshoring. We were offshoring production. We weren't investing in the middle class. We were investing in the capital class or stockholders. It was executives and shareholders that were getting most of the benefits of retail. Certainly wasn't the worker on the floor. Many retailers were suppressing those wages. When we look at education, we've seen education rates actually drop as government funding of education has declined. We went from a place in the 60s where we were spending about 10% of GDP on education to a place today where it's less than 2%. So all of these systems now are starting to come apart, these systems that were fundamental to the kind of growth that we saw over the last half of a century. And that led me to believe that maybe as dire as that situation seems across all of these things, even democracy, for Pete's sake, is coming into question today. A third of Canadians don't believe in democracy anymore, if you can believe that. But maybe as dire as that situation seems, maybe these are the new frontiers of competition. Maybe if companies begin to look at, could my participation and my support of democracy in this country become an advantage? If I begin not thwarting government policy, not sidestepping it, but working to be a partner at the table, could I gain an advantage, and could I build more trust in our government at the same time? If I reevaluate my notion of capitalism, if as Walmart is doing, Walmart is now giving bonuses and increased wages to its employees to the tune that a manager of a US Walmart now could make $400,000 a year. So they're starting to recognize that, hey, listen, if we continue to suppress wages, all we're hurting is our own customer base, the middle class. So we need to rejuvenate the middle class. Education, if we reevaluate our education thinking the way Google is now providing certificate courses in programming for $49 a month through Coursera, and it's actually allowing someone with that certificate to apply for a job at Google without the expense or the debt involved in a university education. So I guess what I'm saying is, if we look at the things that are broken in society today or on the decline, and as organizations, if we look at those differently and say, how could we actually contribute to rejuvenating that system somehow, but also do so in a way that gives us an advantage over our competitors that are still out there thinking we need cheaper products and we need more products and we need a new ad campaign. I think we're on the precipice of that new, really exciting era of competition, and one that could actually wind up making the world a better place.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much, Doug, for joining us today.
It's been my pleasure, Mario. Thank you.